colleague and friend, Kristen Carpenter. She's the newest member of the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, representing North America, and she's also the Council Tree Professor of Law at the University of Colorado Law School. Kristen is a graduate of Dartmouth College and Harvard Law School. She teaches and writes in the areas of property, cultural property, American Indian law, and Indigenous peoples and international law. So please welcome Professor Carpenter as the moderator for this panel.
Sharon Bennett's here.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'd like to return the favor to Carla Fredericks, who is, I think, in many ways the unsung hero of this event. She, together with our American Indian Law fellow, Kate Finn, have done really all of the very, very hard work to bring us together, working with the Permanent Forum, of course, but the on-the-ground work here at the University of Colorado. Carla is a member of the Mandan, Arikara, and Hidatsa Nations and runs our Indian Law Clinic here and really does so with incredible grace and effectiveness, bringing our students opportunities to do this advocacy work in domestic and international legal forums. I really do want to acknowledge her, and if we could all give her a round of applause. As Carla mentioned, I am a professor here at CU as well as a member of the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and it's really a pleasure to be here with you and the distinguished panel. So many people who are working to realize the rights set forth in the Declaration in various capacities around the globe. Today, as we gather to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the UN General Assembly's adoption of the Declaration, a watershed event recognizing Indigenous peoples both individually and collectively as a matter of international human rights law, this panel reminds us that the history of the Declaration is actually much longer than 10 years. In one view, I think, the history of the Declaration goes back to Indigenous peoples, their own origin stories and cultural traditions that set forth values and practices about how to treat one another, how to treat the land, how to treat the other living beings around us. It is these values so challenged in history that Indigenous peoples assert vitally and powerfully in contemporary advocacy today. The history of Indigenous peoples' advocacy in international forums as we conceive them today also is an occasion to remember the leaders who went before all of us, the Haudenosaunee and Maori people, some of their descendants in the room today, who traveled to the League of Nations in the 1920s to try to make the case for the rights of Indigenous peoples as a matter of treaty law in those settings. And most directly today, we remember that the history of the Declaration goes back to the 1970s and 80s, 90s and 2000s, when Indigenous people and their advocates, some of them on this panel, developed the vision for a special instrument dedicated to the rights of Indigenous peoples as subjects of international law, and then undertook the years of hard work, negotiation, drafting, and diplomacy leading to the adoption of the Declaration. Accordingly, this panel will give those who did so much of the work a chance to reflect on it so that we can all better understand the Declaration, as well as to commemorate the work that they've done and the platform that they've created for all of us to go forward. I will only briefly introduce the distinguished panelists who will have a chance to share in narrative fashion their own experiences in this process. Our format, after I do the introductions, will be first to have a video presentation by Ambassador Chavez, who is unable to be here in person, and then I'll pose some questions to our distinguished panelists so that we'll have a lively conversation and leave time for you all also to engage and to ask questions. I also want to acknowledge my students, many of whom I see out there in the room, and many traditional leaders from North America, and I really appreciate all of you for making the journey and being with us here today. So on the panel, and I think I'll just go down the row, starting with Jim Anaya, my friend and dean of the University of Colorado Law School, who most recently served as the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Many of you know Jim for his advocacy work as well as his scholarly work, laying the intellectual framework for articulation of self-determination, property, and equality as rights of Indigenous peoples. Next to him is Ms. Vicky Tali-Corpuz, who currently serves as the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. She previously served as chair of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and she is a longtime well-known leader from Indigenous people in the Philippines. Next to her is Mr. Les Malzar, a member currently of the UN Permanent Forum, who joins us from Australia, where he served for 2 terms as co-chair of the National Congress for Australia's First Peoples. He has a very long and distinguished career as an Aboriginal leader from Australia. Next to him is Mrs. Tarsila Rivera, a member of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, as well as president of Chirapec, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly and probably not, Center for Indigenous Cultures of Peru, where she is one of the most recognized voices and faces in the Indigenous struggle there today. Daly Sambojoro is a professor at the University of Alaska, Anchorage, where she is well known for her advocacy for Alaska Native and other Arctic peoples and participation in the Inuit Circumpolar Council. She previously served on the Permanent Forum as well. Finally, by video, Ambassador Luis Enrique Chavez served as permanent representative of Peru to international organizations in Geneva. He was the chairman rapporteur of the working group on the draft declaration, shepherding this document through much of its earlier stages. I should say I'm not doing justice to the bios of any of these speakers who are truly the leaders for our generation in this work, and I hope you'll consult their longer bios in the program. But with that, we are going to give the ambassador some uninterrupted time to present, and then we'll start the back and forth among all of us. So thank you. Ambassador?
Good afternoon, good morning there. Thank you. Thank you very much for allowing me to associate myself with this celebration. I think it's very important to celebrate the efforts we made and all the difficulties we had to overcome before reaching a successful outcome with the adoption of the declaration 10 years ago. Let me thank in particular to the organizers of this other attention, but unfortunately I had to stay for professional reasons. But thanks to technology, I have the unique opportunity to share with you some thoughts after 10 years. I think it's important, first and foremost, to exercise our duty of memory, because in talking about indigenous people's rights, we cannot look forward if we're not fully aware of what happened in the past and without knowing the history of the recognition of the rights enshrined in the declaration. It is also difficult for me to speak in simple terms about the declaration because the declaration itself is a very complex subject matter, and also because, and maybe foremost, because I'm so personally involved that it's extremely difficult to make a fully accurate assessment of this issue. So, in order to avoid subjectivity and in few words, simply allow me to highlight some facts that, in my view, are distinctive features that make the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples a unique international instrument. First, I think we have to be aware that the declaration is the result of an extremely long journey that began back in the mid-80s. So it is the result of around 25 years of struggle led by indigenous peoples themselves. Second, and as a sequence of what I just said, the declaration also demonstrates that persistence and patience can achieve almost everything without the United Nations system. So now I think that indigenous peoples are fully aware that you should never give up. Thirdly, I think the declaration is also unique because it is, to my knowledge at least, first time in UN history where the beneficiaries of a specific set of rights participated actively and on an equal footing in the elaboration of a set of rules pertaining to them. And when I said in an equal footing, I mean together with the governmental representatives. And I think this is a premiere in UN history. Human beings, individuals, and peoples duly represented, taking part in international multilateral negotiation. Fourthly, ultimately, I think that the declaration succeeded because the force of a sense of justice and fairness shall always prevail above the fears and the interest of a wide range of governments. It is just a matter of time and patience, and indigenous peoples have shown patience and force and consistency. Then I think also that the declaration is the end of a journey, but also the beginning of another journey. The declaration itself paved the way for the creation of new mechanisms and specific. It is also the starting point of a whole new relationship of indigenous peoples with their national states and indigenous peoples within the international system. And finally, I think that also the declaration has demonstrated what are the limits of the consensus rule. And this is also a cornerstone in multilateral negotiation, because we tend to believe that if we want to achieve a meaningful outcome in an international negotiation, consensus is a must. And such a major achievement as the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Declaration shows otherwise. Now we tend to forget that the declaration was adopted through two different processes of voting. First, at the Council of Human Rights, at its first session. Eventually, time has proven that we all took the right decision, we made the right call. There was a lot of reluctance, actually, to confront. And I heard a lot of voices suggesting that it was worth to try and continue negotiating towards consensus. And back in 2006, with a group of indigenous peoples and representative of governments, we all collectively took the decision to stop the negotiation, to call for a vote, and to preserve what we had achieved so far. Simply to conclude, let me read out something I wrote immediately after the adoption of the declaration, with actually what was my assessment 10 years ago. And I quote myself, indulge, with your indulgence. Although we can always wonder whether these impasses, and I was referring to the outstanding issues like self-determination, territorial integrity, and other key issues, could have been overcome with a consensual text. Although I do not rule it out, I sincerely do not believe that they could at least not in the short term, given the nature of the difficulties some delegations had. In any case, it is no longer of any importance. A unique opportunity to obtain a declaration presented itself, and we were able to make most of it. I'm convinced in time, this declaration will take its place as one of the universal human rights instruments, the major example of which, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, let us not forget, was also adopted by means of a vote. So I said this 10 years ago, and now I'm happy to see that time has put all things into the right perspective. Those countries who voted against the declaration have withdrawn their reservations ever since. I think today we can say that, and we can fairly say that the declaration is a document, a set of rules universally accepted, as well as the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. We will celebrate next year the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration. We are now celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Declaration. I'm pretty sure that there will be more anniversaries for this declaration, and more than one reason every year to be satisfied for all the effort we put into this declaration. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador.
All my colleagues.
Thank you for joining us and sharing your moving words. I'll start with an open-ended question to the panel. And I know that each of you could keep our attention for quite a long time, given your experiences, but I'll ask you to answer briefly so that we can keep the conversation going, even though these are significant and large questions. The first is if you would take us back in time, since this is the historical reflection panel, to think about when you first envisioned or began to participate in the process of drafting a declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples. Share the setting for us a little bit, and particularly, what were your hopes and aspirations? Maybe we'll start with Professor Anaya and go down the row. Dean Anaya. I'm doing it too. He's my own dean.
Thank you, Kristen. Professor.
It's an expert carpenter.
Yeah, you can call me Jim.
Thanks. Okay, on it.
Yeah, I first went to the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations in 1984. I was just a year out of law school, and didn't know much about what the working group was about. No one really did. That was I think the beauty of it. It was an organization, or really a committee, a group of the Subcommission on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights. It had a different name at the time, a little longer. And it was a subcommission of the Human Rights Commission, and so it was the lowest run organization at the UN. But it opened its doors to Indigenous peoples from around the world. And the first time I went, it was in one of the smaller rooms, conference rooms of the UN, and in the old part of the Palais des Nations in Geneva. And what struck me was that it was a fascinating place for people to express themselves and tell their stories. And that's really what those initial meetings were about, where people would just come and tell their stories. And what began to emerge in those early days was a commonality of experiences, both in terms of what had happened in the past, what was happening now, and a commonality of vision for the future. And that was really the seed of that discussion, that kind of discussion, very open-ended discussion, provided the seeds for what eventually became the declaration. At those first meetings of the working group, the thought was that at some point in the future there would be a discussion about a declaration. And that came much more quickly than was expected, because it was in 1985 that the declaration, the following year, that the working group itself, the 5 members, the official 5 members, actually started drafting and inviting comments by indigenous peoples. But those initial meetings were just open-ended, fascinating discussions. I won't get into the after hours kind of activities. We'll leave that for the after hours of this event. But that was fascinating as well.
Ms. Tully-Cruz? Right, and please turn on the mic so that
Thank you very
the
much.
interpretation can pick up on it. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Christine. Yes, I got involved with the declaration also in 1985, the first year that the declaration was being drafted. The reason why I got involved with this was the Philippines was under martial law. Martial law was declared in 1972, and many of our communities have been subjected to grave human rights violations. There was a big dam that the president wanted to build, funded by the World Bank, and there was a logging concession that was going to eat up our forests. And so we got involved with this, but we didn't know what to do when our people were being arrested, tortured. Several of our elders were brought to jail. And that's when we heard about the United Nations. Georgie, I remember Georgie Carino, who was involved. He was in the first meeting in 1982, came back home and mentioned that there is this body that's going to talk about what's happening to indigenous peoples, and they will be drafting a declaration. So my organization, at that time, the Cordillera People's Alliance, sent me to take part in this process. And indeed, when I first went there, of course, my only obsession was to tell about my story about how our communities are being bombed and how our people are being arbitrarily arrested. And then I found out that many other people in various parts of the world are suffering the same problems. So for me, that was really, it provided me a fuller picture of what indigenous peoples are faced with. And it convinced me that indeed a declaration should really be created, because the existing human rights conventions are not normally talking about the issues that were being presented before the working group members. So that was a very historic moment for me, because it sort of created, it showed me the kind of solidarity that indigenous peoples can have amongst themselves, and the possibilities for indigenous peoples to be able to influence a body like the United Nations to develop an instrument that will protect our rights. Of course, it was a very slow process. Most of the times what we were listening to were really the problems that were being presented. But I think that's what made the declaration very significant, because each of the articles of the declaration really is a response to these problems brought before the working group members. So that for me is something that taught me that if we want to develop something, it really has to be based on the real blood, sweat, and tear situation of peoples who are being, whose rights are being violated and whose rights are going to be developed by a particular body. So I think that's where it all started. And I took part after 1985. Almost every year I have been there until its adoption.
Thank you. Mr. Malazar.
Thank you, Kristen. I really got involved in 1998. It was very specific for me. Up until that time, in Australia, we've been making some progressive headway with the government. For example, we were promised national land rights legislation in 1985. The government reneged on that in 1985. A few years later, the High Court came down instead with the native title decision, the Mabo decision, which said, for the first time in law in Australia, that Aboriginal people had pre-existing rights that needed to be respected in our process. Similarly, around that time, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission was created, which had at the time over 400 elected representatives, to a strong voice to government as well as taking over the programs from the official government department on Aboriginal affairs and so on. So we were making great progress during the 1980s and 1990s. However, what happened in 1998 is the government at the time passed legislation to renege on all the rights that had been found in native title. The Native Title Amendment Act of 1998 basically overrode, it suspended the operation of our Racial Discrimination Act and overrode some fundamental rights that had come forward in the Mabo decision. At the time, I was Deputy Chair of the National Indigenous Working Group. That was the collective of all the bodies that had been working on land rights and native title for about a decade. And we called together our legal advisors at the time, including senior counsels who had participated and won in the Mabo case and other significant legal matters. And their advice to us was, there's nowhere to go with this in Australia, with the politics or the legal system. The court is conservative. There is nothing to argue at the moment. We have to bide our time until we get a better political environment. So I immediately went to Geneva and started looking around. And the first place I went to was the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And some of you might be aware, around that time in 1998, we invoked the Early Warning Urgent Action procedure, and they immediately called Australia to account for these amendments to the native title laws and so on. It led to quite a heavy process being applied on the issue of race discrimination. And I mention race discrimination because I think that's a very, very large element of what we're talking about in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We have no special rights. We are simply overcoming the ones which are being discriminated against us. At the same time, I went and participated in the working group on the draft declaration, and I participated at every session since that time onwards, becoming very, very involved and integrated in the process. So from our viewpoint in Australia, where we have no treaties, we have no Charter of Human Rights, we have no basis of Aboriginal rights in Australia, we have governments who are still to this very day willing to invoke laws which are racially discriminatory, knowing they're racially discriminatory and knowing they're in breach, are still willing to do that, then the Declaration has become our lifeline, our hope to go and fight for these rights. So I'll leave it at that point, that it became very important to find a standard somewhere on which our people in Australia could continue our struggle to get our rights recognised. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Rivera.
Voy a hablar en español, ¿no? ¿Se oye bien? ¿Todo bien? Yeah. En realidad hay que expresar primeramente la alegría de estar no sé cuántas generaciones juntas y sobre todo encontrarnos y reencontrarnos para hablar de procesos de retroceso y éxito. En ese sentido, desde mi región, lo que puedo compartir con ustedes es que el contexto cuando llegamos a las Naciones Unidas era como llegar a la Torre de Babel, porque eran pueblos indígenas de diferentes partes del mundo, hablando diferentes idiomas, y los de América Latina monolingües en nuestro castellano. Entonces, enfrentamos en primer lugar la barrera lingüística con nuestros propios hermanos que hablaban inglés o francés. La segunda cosa, para estar como indígenas en igualdad de condiciones, es que la mayoría de los hermanos y hermanas de otras regiones tenían alguna formación en derechos. Estaban estudiando leyes o eran abogados, ¿no? Y nuestra región éramos activistas de base. Y entonces, la primera conclusión para nosotros es que fue una gran escuela de aprendizaje entre nosotros en relación a los derechos. Y personalmente llegué el año 87 desde Perú, donde ya habíamos muerto más de 15,000 indígenas en los Andes, porque desde el año 80 se declaró una guerra interna entre el Estado peruano y un movimiento alzado en armas que se llamaba Sendero Luminoso. Entonces, llegamos con esta carga a las Naciones Unidas, principalmente al grupo de trabajo, y descubrimos que los indígenas teníamos derechos. Y eso fue algo importante porque encontramos esta comunidad mundial usando la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, hablando de derechos humanos de los pueblos indígenas, y esta experiencia nos sirvió para mirar mejor el contexto nacional. Eso en relación a qué significó nuestra llegada. Y podemos tener muchas anécdotas maravillosas de entendernos, no entendernos, que si estamos en una sala trabajando un párrafo, un artículo, todos los que hablan inglés entienden y los que no hablábamos inglés no entendíamos. Entonces logramos también la solidaridad de hermanas y hermanos que en ese tiempo se llamaba boicot. Hay que hacer boicot hasta que pongan la traducción fuera de las sesiones formales. O sea, ha sido todo un proceso para mí de aprendizaje y de interaprendizaje. Aquí estamos todos los que nos conocemos desde esos años, ¿no? Y yo me acuerdo que Vicky, por ejemplo, va a redactar un párrafo. Yo iba donde ella le decía, ¿puedes poner esto? Ya, dame pues eso, ¿no? Igual pasaba con otras personas. O sea, la construcción de la alianza para lograr cada párrafo e incluir, por ejemplo, en mi caso específicamente, fue conservar, por ejemplo, los derechos territoriales en caso de conflicto interno, desplazamiento interno, porque el párrafo o el grupo estaba tratando en el caso de desplazamiento externo, porque venían de experiencias de pueblos que migraban a raíz de los conflictos en el país. Y entonces, la alianza entre los que pueden, los que no pueden, los que saben, y también redactar apropiadamente cada párrafo ha sido toda una escuela. Y luego hemos aprendido a hablar con los estados. No nos veíamos bien, pero ahí aprendimos a hablar entre indígenas, entre nosotros. El artículo 3, ustedes se acordarán cuánto tiempo duró el derecho a la libre determinación, ¿no? Retroceso y avance, y luego hablar con los estados. Ahí me quedo por ahora. Gracias.
Gracias. Professor Dora.
It's green.
Oh, it's not turning green.
Okay. Take this.
First of all, I want to thank the organizers and congratulate Jim on his appointment as dean here at the law school. This is an extraordinary accomplishment, and I actually, in thinking about it, recall a conversation when you decided to pursue tenure. And in my mind, it was a turning point because it meant that you were going to join the academy in a way that might then distance you from the advocacy. But we've seen that that absolutely is not the case, and that you've been able to balance both the academy and the advocacy. And also, Kristen, in your appointment to the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, new blood, new perspectives, and importantly, indigenous women's perspectives. So I congratulate you both. From my point of view, the 1970s, Inuit, this is a generation of development. The pipeline generation, as one of my cousins at home refers to it, for Inupiat in Alaska, and the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement and hydroelectric, and forcing development without the consultation and consent of indigenous peoples. And this is the context that I was living in at the time. And in June of 1977, in fact, a couple months before the conference, the NGO conference on racism and racial discrimination being perpetrated against indigenous peoples in the Western Hemisphere was taking place, our own people were organizing because we wanted a seat at the table. We wanted a slice of the pie. We knew what was going to be coming down the path in terms of oil development, hydroelectric, mining, and a whole host of issues facing Arctic indigenous peoples. And so it's against this backdrop that prompted me to become engaged. And in relation to the UN Declaration, in fact, I was thinking about it. I met Gerald Wilkinson even a year before I met you, Jim, in 1984 at a conference focused on the 50th anniversary of the Indian Reorganization Act. And it was an opportunity for Alaska Native tribal governments to begin voicing their concerns about how these federal policies were impacting us, never mind the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act itself. In 1984, I attended on behalf of my own people the World Council of Indigenous Peoples session in Panama City, Panama. I met Les Mauser there. And at that conference, myself and Willie Littlechild and a few others were sequestered in a small room off the side of the main hall of the hotel that we were staying in and drafted an Indigenous declaration. And the strategy was to draft this declaration in order then to hand it off to the Working Group on Indigenous Populations and urge them to simply adopt that declaration. We're fortunate that that declaration, that Indigenous declaration, is memorialized in Jim's book, Indigenous Peoples in International Law. And so on behalf of my own people, but then the engagement at the international level, and specifically with the work related to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples began, because I was then asked from that 84 meeting to take that document and make an intervention at the next session of the working group and respectfully request, so it was more like a demand, that it be annexed to the report of the working group. And so from that time forward, I maintained my involvement in the drafting of the UN Declaration, and like others here at the table, once engaged, it was difficult to disengage, and because of the hopes of Indigenous peoples and what was actually facing our own communities, whether it was development or, more often than not, in terms of, and it's already been referenced, the stories, the expressions of the stories and the experiences of Indigenous peoples were coming forward and being morphed into what we understood to be an articulation of our individual and collective rights as distinct peoples through the UN Declaration. I just want to mention a couple of key turning points. I'll try to do it quickly. At one point in time in the discussions and the expression of stories, and it was a group of Indigenous peoples from Latin America, I don't exactly remember where, the story they told was so horrific that it shut down the interpreters. The interpreters became so emotional that they could not interpret what was being told to them. I'm not kidding. And in my mind, it was a very emotional turning point, because lives were being lost by the minute. And here we were talking about the urgency, and this is in the 80s, the urgency of the conditions facing Indigenous peoples. In addition, we started to see important turning points as far as the Australian delegations understanding and interpretation of the right of self-determination. There were, the backroom informal dialogues, and I think this was significant. That finally a member state was attempting to break out of the nation state of mind in terms of the application of the right of self-determination to indigenous peoples, and as someone has already said, moving from objects to subjects of international law. Then, of course, I recall the hopeful voice of a Brazilian diplomat who was extraordinarily prepared and came to sessions with a notebook of all the relevant international human rights instruments and made the linkages between all of those instruments and the rationale and arguments that indigenous peoples were putting forward. And I don't know whatever happened to her, but it was, to me, I saw that there are people associated with their formal member states, and they have a heart too. They want to do the right thing. Of course, Canada's statement on the right of self-determination was a significant turning point as well, though it was qualified to some extent in terms of the way they brought the articulation forward, but it was significant that they said that all peoples have the right of self-determination, including indigenous peoples. And to me, that was an important turning point. Then Les's comment about racism and racial discrimination and the efforts of Australian Aboriginal people and the use of CERD as an important treaty body is dead on. There was a moment in which it was very clear that our quest for equality and respect for and recognition of indigenous rights was couched in terms of the reality of the violation of peremptory norms of international law by governments. Well, we didn't even have anything to do with the creation of those standards, yet what we're seeing in our own specific context was racism and discrimination being perpetrated against indigenous peoples in the articulation of the right of self-determination in the halls of the United Nations. And so I think that this is it's taking different forms, and it's becoming, in some cases, much more blatant. And I don't want to foretell discussions in some of the breakout sessions that we're going to have, but I'm certain that the call to us to illustrate good practices, best practices, that maybe they're too far and few between because of this strong undercurrent of racism and racial discrimination that continues to be perpetrated against us.
Thank you very much. I'm struck. Yes, thank you. By several things. One is how deeply grounded each of these speakers is in a community and tradition of Indigenous and domestic advocacy that informed their work pretty much across the board internationally, right? These weren't people who started as international diplomats and kind of became interested in Indigenous peoples. They, came out of their communities and brought those voices and aspirations to bear on the process. Along those lines, one question I have, and everybody doesn't need to answer, but it's something I've been wondering about, especially because I think it comes up today. So some of us who work with Indigenous peoples still today find some skepticism about whether the language of human rights, and Ms. Rivera's comments really touched on this, but whether the language of human rights is consonant with Indigenous values and norms, the language of rights itself versus responsibilities and kinship and other concepts, and also whether the institutions of the UN are places where we can really make a difference in the real lives of Indigenous peoples. And I know there are tribal leaders out there today still thinking about, whether they should devote resources to this kind of work. And I guess I wonder, from your historical perspective, did you encounter tensions, right? When you were thinking about, well, what words are we going to use in the Declaration to express the experiences and values of our communities in a way that's going to be meaningful? And how did you navigate those institutions? I mean, when I go to the UN, you still have to wait in a long line, and it costs a lot of money to get there, and all of that kind of stuff. So what are the tensions, and how did you figure out how to approach them in terms of language and institutional barriers? and I will invite anybody to respond.
Yeah, I'll start.
Ms. Talley-Corpus?
Yes. I do understand the skepticism that's there, and I speak about that from my own perspective. You know, in the Philippines, when we started engaging with the United Nations, several indigenous peoples are already part of the armed movement against the government because of the martial law declaration and because of all the oppression. So there were people who really took up arms and fought against the dictatorship, you know? And of course, on our part, we created a movement of indigenous peoples to articulate what the problems, the problems that we are facing. So for those very radical groups who took up arms, they are very skeptical. They don't think that the UN is going to do anything for indigenous peoples, you know, and that the only option is to really take up arms and fight against this oppressive government. But on our part, our elders were telling us that, you know, yes, that's one aspect of the struggle, but we need to really make this government understand that they cannot continue oppressing us in this way, and we need to find allies in the rest of the world who will share that view as well. And I think up to now, that kind of tension happens because, of course, we still see really gross violations of human rights continuing. But I think that what has changed is that indigenous peoples have realized that they have to enter into a dialogue with the government. They cannot keep on fighting and sacrificing lives. And so that led to the adoption of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act in the Philippines. Several of us got engaged with a constitutional process after the dictatorship fell, and we got the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act adopted. And that, to a certain extent, addressed, together with the declaration, it did address some of the problems that indigenous peoples have been facing. There are now so-called certificates of ancestral domain titles or certificate of ancestral land titles, which recognize the rights of indigenous peoples to those lands. And this has happened not just because people have taken up violent options, but primarily because people decided that we cannot be sacrificing all these lives. We have to really do something along those lines. And I think that's the role that the declaration has played. For me, even now, as in my role as the special rapporteur, I think one of the contributions of the declaration is to really provide some options for indigenous peoples so that they will not be forced into those very radical options that in the end will not address the problems that we face. And I think that the strengthening of indigenous peoples in many parts of the world has really been influenced very much by the adoption of the UN Declaration. So I think we cannot deny the existence of that skepticism. We have to deal with it, but we also have to really present to the indigenous peoples various options in terms of how the problems can be solved, both by the states and of course, by the dominant society for that matter. So for me, that tension cannot be ignored. You have to directly deal with it, and you have to constantly engage in dialogue amongst ourselves as indigenous peoples, but also between ourselves and the duty bearers of human rights.
Thank you. And Mr. Rivera, did you want to answer? Ms. Rivera, I'm sorry.
Yes. Myself?
From Alzar.
Sorry. Yes, look, I wanted to say that the way that I have experienced things in doing this work is that everything is structured within the way in which the world has developed its international governance since World War II. The United Nations was created to deal with what was the discrimination against peoples, the economic exploitation of peoples, and the Charter of the United Nations is based upon the right of all peoples to self-determination, acknowledging that member states are supposed to be the institutions representing peoples, but also acknowledging in the way in which the words are used in all of this, a state may have a population of more than one peoples living within it. And of course, when you look at Chapter 11 of the Charter, you see that it also deals with decolonisation, deals with deals with peoples who are non-self-governing in their own territories, and provides direction to states there, or it actually says there's a sacred duty upon states to ensure that the rights of those peoples to self-governance and autonomy is also respected. So the charter that was established in 1945 and by which the world governance is operating actually leads the path straight to Indigenous peoples. We were forgotten populations, and it was only more recently that there's been this recognition and acknowledgement that Indigenous peoples have been overlooked in the process, and now the Declaration has addressed that in the early preambular paragraphs and the early articles by saying Indigenous peoples are peoples equal to all other peoples of the world and shall be treated without discrimination and so on. So I use those words in there. There's a sacred duty upon states to recognise the self-determination of Indigenous peoples is built into the UN system. Now the UN system, we don't know how long it's going to last. We don't know where it's going. You've got all this sort of heavy politics, and I think that the recent effort we've had to try and get representation of Indigenous peoples at the high levels of the General Assembly and so on puts us in the path of the politics, where the politics is interfering with the norms and standards that the United Nations should be observing. But again, I go back to what people have said already: persistence, perseverance at these sorts of issues will get there. When you look at it, we have choices. The choices are a political fight, a legal fight, or an out-and-out fight, conflict, in order to get our rights. And we can choose any of those paths. None of them is right or wrong, depending on our histories and our circumstances. But that path is there, and it is worth persevering. It has delivered. It will continue to deliver. And one thing I also want to say is that Indigenous people's struggles for our rights preceded the UN. We all know that. We have a great sense of identity as to what our rights are, self-determination, the fact that we have existed before we colonised successfully, and so on. So we have this inbuilt sense of our rights, regardless of what the United Nations might say or frame, or any other system might frame. We have that. And in Australia, as I'm sure elsewhere happens, a lot of our people have gone to what is a passive resistance of saying, we are sovereign, nobody can interfere with our sovereignty. So they're not actively participating in a legal fight. They're not overtly participating in a political fight, but they are passively resisting. Unfortunately, we have a very high prison population, and I think that's one of the indicators of the way in which the systems are clashing in Australia. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think, Ms. Rivera, did you want to answer?
Sí.
And then I'll open it up to some more questions from the audience. Thank you.
Hemos aprendido varios conceptos en el proceso que hoy son totalmente aplicables y válidos, entonces no crea duda. Por ejemplo, la complementariedad entre la Declaración Universal de Derechos Humanos y la declaración nuestra, para nosotros es un documento con conceptos totalmente éticos, válidos y que todo Estado, todo gobernante debe aplicar. Esa es la primera cosa que hemos aprendido y tratamos de transmitirlo en esa dimensión, o sea, dejar un poco de lado la cuestión legalista, ¿no? Sino más bien ir a la necesidad de construir la convivencia en los países entre la diversidad. La segunda cosa es que en este proceso hemos aprendido todos los mecanismos que existen y que también son utilizables para los pueblos indígenas. Por ejemplo, como mujeres indígenas, nosotras más nos hemos incorporado en el proceso de elaboración de la declaración, trabajando desde una perspectiva más bien colectiva como pueblo, y habíamos ignorado los escenarios donde las mujeres iban a defender derechos. Hoy estamos ya en otra etapa. Estamos con una claridad, las mujeres indígenas, de defender los derechos individuales, que tiene que ver con la violencia en la vida misma, pero también transitado a conceptualizar que la violencia en nuestros territorios, negando derechos, también es algo contra el que estamos luchando como mujeres. O sea, hay mucho aprendizaje y estamos respondiendo a una sociedad legal que nos ha excluido históricamente. Entonces, cuando hablamos, por ejemplo, de pueblos preexistentes, ya es un concepto que lo usamos dentro de nuestros estados y lo hemos aprendido en este escenario internacional, entonces es totalmente válido, yo creo que no hay ninguna duda. Y cuando tenemos que responder si es que los indígenas queremos derechos especiales, no son especiales porque nosotros somos pueblos preexistentes y los derechos humanos universales también están incluidos para los pueblos indígenas que somos seres humanos, ¿no? Entonces, en ese sentido ahí vemos gran avance y un enriquecimiento mutuo para luchar desde los contextos nacionales también, usando las herramientas internacionales, porque estando en países totalmente colonizados y todavía con gobiernos muy colonizantes y colonizados, pues es muy difícil, por ejemplo, que comprendan que hay una ideología del racismo y que eso se refleja en las políticas excluyentes. Entonces, es todo un proceso.
Thank you. Professor Duro.
Yeah, thanks. Just very quickly, yes.
Yes.
The answer is yes to your question about tensions and about use of rights language. I mean, this did emerge. And also the question certainly by some of the tribal governments at home about the expense, the cost, the level of commitment, certainly the ICC membership questioned this. But ultimately there was a recognition that the UN declaration and now complemented by ILO Convention 169 and the American Declaration that we need these tools in order to try to force and redefine state behavior in our context. And so I think that the tensions remain because indigenous peoples had little resources then. Those conditions remain the same. Indigenous peoples have little resources now in terms of constantly engaging and utilizing the processes. But in the end of the day, I think we gained an important set of tools and that is reflected in the human rights framework that we've all been introduced to.
Thank you. And it also strikes me that, the question of whether to engage internationally is almost a question that the moment has passed, right? We live in this international world around us. The interests of indigenous peoples are so linked to all of the other peoples in the world that, we're there. Issues are coming up in cross-border settings that, our tribes and others all need representation in. So there are those tensions, but it seems like we have to navigate them in one way or another. I'd like to invite some audience questions while also planting a seed in the panelists' minds, just if you can address this point before we close. And we're going to go over maybe 5 minutes to allow some audience questions. And the question for you all just to keep in mind is, as you think about this next generation of advocates following in your footsteps, the new blood, as Professor Duro said, what do you want to imprint in our brains and our souls about your struggles and efforts? What do you want us to carry forward as we pursue the next generation of advocacy and even the younger students out there pursue going forward? With that as sort of a backdrop, are there questions from the audience that would like to be addressed? I think we have a microphone coming.
Thank you. I guess the issue of the Rohingya are in people's minds right now. I was wondering whether you would reflect in your comments, not necessarily only in the 3 minutes that you have left for this panel, but the rest of the day. How would you deal with the pre-existing Rohingya people in Burma and how they've been driven out, how they're homeless right now? We talk about self-determination, but given your struggle, if you could bear that case in mind for the rest of the day, I'd be grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. She referenced the issue of the Rohingya people. And yes, I think they are in all of our minds and may come up more particularly in some of the conversations. Are there any concluding questions about the declaration itself? Professor Morris.
Good morning to you all.
Morning.
First, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on traditional homeland of the Cheyenne and Arapaho people and Ute people, and thank them for allowing us to be here. My name is Glenn Morris. I'm from the Shawnee Nation. I am the director of the Fourth World Center for the Study of Indigenous Law and Politics, and I appreciated Professor Carpenter's question about individual reflections on the Declaration, but it seemed to me kind of like, having been involved with the process myself, that it was kind of like listening to passengers on a train without talking about the train. That this is a movement. This is a movement that came from someplace. A couple of the speakers, Darcilla and even Vicky, talked about larger struggles that led to Indigenous people showing up at the United Nations, but the working group didn't drop out of the sky. The Declaration didn't drop out of the sky. It came from someplace. And this is also another anniversary, the 40th anniversary of Indigenous people showing up in Geneva and kicking the doors open, saying, we expect our place at the community of nations. And so it was from that. And those people who went in 1977 didn't talk about autonomy. They didn't talk about, frankly, Jim, they didn't talk about reconciliation because there had never been conciliation. And so how could there be reconciliation if there had never been conciliation with the invader states? And so I appreciate your comments about the broader context. There was mention of Descaje or Fernando or Ratana in the 1920s going to the League of Nations. This didn't just start with the Declaration. And there are a lot of young people here who don't know that history. And I'd appreciate some comment about talking about the train and not just our being passengers on the train. Namechito, thank you.
Thank you. A provocative question for all of us, and maybe, and this is only the beginning of the day's conversation, but a good one. And perhaps I'll give Dean and I the last word here.
Thank you, Professor Morris Glenn, for that and for emphasizing the train. I mean, you're absolutely right. The Declaration is the result of a movement, a larger movement that goes back not just a couple of decades, but really 500 years, and that owes itself to the struggle of Indigenous peoples around the world from a grassroots basis. In referring to the working group on Indigenous peoples, I alluded to the storytelling and said that the storytelling was by Indigenous peoples from around the world. These were representatives coming from communities, from the United States, from Canada, from other countries, telling their stories. And it was these stories that were part of that movement and that resulted in ultimately the words that we see now in the Declaration. So we can't forget that. And, you know, Kristen asked about the limitations of the debates about the human rights concepts and the institutions. I mean, those were discussions going on. But interestingly, in my observations anyway, leaders of Indigenous peoples were simply bypassing those kind of discussions and simply getting on with the movement and expressing aspirations and issues in terms that were real to their experiences. And that was the stuff of the ideas that ultimately found themselves in the articulation of rights in the Declaration. And the Declaration is an imperfect instrument because the language of human rights imperfectly captures those sentiments and those aspirations. And the institutions of the United States are imperfect and imperfectly accommodate to those aspirations. We see that. But as we've observed, each of us, and mentioned, it's about reform, it's about moving forward, it's about change, however incremental and imperfect as it goes along it may be. But thank you, Glenn, and for reminding us about that movement, and as you said artfully, the train that carries those passengers.
Thank you. As we conclude, I think one other theme that I heard emerge was not only was each of you deeply involved in a struggle of your own communities that you brought to the UN, but you found commonality of experience and identity and values, and that solidarity, I think, among Indigenous peoples, a shared identity emerging across the world is, part and parcel of that train. I don't know if that's the metaphor, but I get it, right? Like we're all on board together in a lot of ways while truly respecting our different circumstances. I want to honor and thank our very, very distinguished panel, but before you clap, I think we're going to have just maybe a 5-minute break and then reconvene here for a fireside chat with the former and current Special Rapporteur. So thank you to all of you.